Don't worry about the prices. I'm paying. She barely has anything left.
You said that here?
My mother doesn't need to see the prices my son Ethan announced across the elegant restaurant table. I'm paying. She barely has anything left anyway. Natalie gave me a sympathetic smile while Bradley Sutton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I felt my face burn. 6 years after burying my husband, my own son was telling strangers I was broke as if my entire life could be reduced to a story that made him look generous. I could have corrected him. I almost did. Then I noticed the restaurant owner standing across the dining room. Henry Whitmore wasn't looking at Ethan. He was staring directly at me, and the expression on his face wasn't pity. It was recognition. Before I tell you why, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known you better, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have corrected Ethan right there at the table or stayed silent like I did? The life my son never bothered to understand. If you had driven past my house on a quiet Tuesday morning, you probably would have understood why Ethan believed the story he told about me. At least you might have understood how he convinced himself it was true. I lived in the same 2-story brick house in Charlotte, North Carolina, where my husband Richard and I had spent most of our marriage. It was comfortable, but it wasn't impressive by the standards Ethan had come to admire. The shutters needed repainting. The kitchen hadn't been remodeled in 15 years. My refrigerator didn't connect to the internet, and my countertops weren't imported marble. In the driveway sat a 9-year-old silver Toyota. I bought my clothes mostly when I needed them. I clipped coupons, occasionally cooked at home, and still turned off lights when I left a room. To Ethan, all of that meant one thing. His mother had run out of money. What he never understood was that simplicity had been my choice. Richard and I had been married for 41 years when I lost him. Even now, 6 years after his death, I sometimes woke expecting to hear him downstairs making coffee. Richard was the kind of man who could spend 20 minutes comparing the price of 2 boxes of cereal and then calmly invest $50,000 in a commercial property because he'd studied the numbers for 6 months. He wasn't cheap. He was deliberate. So was I. I spent more than 30 years working in food service management and restaurant development. I started as an assistant manager when I was 24, back when women in management were still regularly mistaken for secretaries. Over the years, I learned nearly every part of the business: labor costs, purchasing leases, vendor contracts, menu pricing, expansion planning. By my 40s, restaurant owners were paying me to tell them why their businesses were losing money. Richard worked in commercial real estate. Between us, dinner conversations often sounded more like business meetings. Lease expires in 4 years. What's the traffic count? Too much debt, good location, bad operator. We weren't glamorous people, we were patient people. And patience, when combined with 40 years of disciplined investing, can build something people don't notice until it's already substantial. But Ethan had never cared much about those conversations. As a teenager, he'd roll his eyes whenever Richard discussed compound growth. "Dad, nobody wants to talk about cap rates at dinner." Richard would laugh. "One day you might." Ethan never did. He wanted the result without being interested in the process. After Richard died, something inside me changed. For almost a year, I barely touched his side of the closet. His navy jacket stayed exactly where he'd left it. His reading glasses remained beside the bed. Even his old coffee mug sat in the cabinet because moving it felt too much like admitting he wasn't coming back. Eventually, though, grief forced me to decide what kind of life I wanted. Richard had left me secure. I didn't need a large house somewhere gated. I didn't need luxury vacations photographed for other people. And I certainly didn't need the black Mercedes he'd insisted on buying me for our 40th anniversary. Every time I sat behind the wheel, I remembered him standing in the dealership grinning like a boy. After his death, driving it hurt more than selling it, so I sold it. A month later, I bought the used Toyota. That decision seemed to be the beginning of Ethan's misunderstanding. "You sold Dad's Mercedes." He stared at the Toyota as though I'd traded the house for a bicycle. "I wasn't using it. You could have told me." "Why?" He hesitated. "I just would have helped you figure something out." I remember studying him. Figure what out, he never answered directly. Then I stopped attending expensive charity dinners Richard and I used to attend together. Ethan noticed that too. I stopped buying designer clothes. I traveled less. I cooked more. To me, I was learning how to live alone. To Ethan, I was cutting expenses because I had to. At first, his concern seemed sweet. "Mom, are the property taxes okay?" "Yes." "Need help with utilities?" "No." "What about insurance handled?" Then his questions became more specific. "How much is coming in every month? That isn't something you need to worry about. I'm your son, and I'm your mother." He would smile as if I were being stubborn. One Sunday afternoon, he arrived carrying his laptop. "I can set up automatic payments for everything." "They're already set up. I could organize your accounts." "They're organized." "Mom, I'm just trying to make your life easier." "I know." And I did believe that then. What bothered me was the assumption underneath his kindness that because I was older and widowed, I must suddenly be incapable of understanding finances I'd managed since before he was born. Natalie reinforced it. She would say things like, "You shouldn't have to worry about complicated things anymore, Florence." Complicated things. I had negotiated 7-figure commercial leases, but apparently online banking was supposed to terrify me at 69. Still, I didn't fight them. Maybe that was my mistake. I didn't show Ethan brokerage statements. I didn't discuss distributions. I never told him exactly what Richard and I had accumulated. Not because I was hiding anything sinister, because it was private. Richard had always said, money should make your life quieter, Florence, not louder. I understood what he meant. Ethan didn't. His own life had become increasingly loud. His house was enormous. His SUV was replaced every few years. He belonged to a private club Richard would have laughed at paying for. Whenever Ethan talked about business, he talked about growth, visibility, and connections. I rarely heard him mention stability. Still, he was my son. I loved him. And when he called one Thursday afternoon and said, "Mom, we're having dinner Saturday," "I'd really like you there," I was genuinely pleased. Just us, mostly family. That phrase should have caught my attention, mostly. But I had spent 6 years learning how empty a house could feel after sunset, and an invitation from my son still mattered to me. Where Whitmore and Stone. I knew the restaurant by reputation. It was one of Charlotte's more successful upscale steakhouses. "That sounds fancy for a family dinner." Ethan laughed. "Don't worry about it. My treat." There was something about the way he said it. "Don't worry about it." As if I had asked whether I could afford to come. I almost corrected him. Instead, I looked toward the framed photograph of Richard sitting on the bookshelf across from me. He was smiling in that picture, one eyebrow slightly raised, as though he knew something I didn't. "All right," I told Ethan. "What time? 7:30. I'll be there." After we hung up, I stood alone in my kitchen for a moment. I had no idea that Ethan wasn't simply inviting his mother to dinner. I didn't know there would be strangers at the table. I didn't know he needed something from one of them. And I certainly didn't know that before dessert arrived, my son would tell an entire table that I was practically broke. But there was something else Ethan didn't know. Something even I hadn't thought about in years. The name Whitmore wasn't new to me. I simply hadn't made the connection yet. The dinner was never about family. Saturday evening, I arrived at Whitmore and Stone 10 minutes early. That was another habit Richard had left me with. If you're exactly on time, he used to say, you've already made someone wonder where you are. The restaurant occupied the ground floor of a restored brick building near uptown Charlotte. Tall windows reflected the evening lights, and through the glass I could see white tablecloths, brass fixtures, dark wood, and servers moving with the quiet precision expensive restaurants seemed to perfect. I looked down at myself before walking inside. Cream blouse, navy slacks, small pearl earrings Richard had given me on our 20th anniversary. Nothing fashionable, nothing embarrassing either. A young hostess greeted me. "Good evening. Do you have a reservation, Crawford?" "Ethan Crawford." Her expression changed immediately. "Of course. Your party is already here. Party, not family." That was the first warning. She led me through the dining room toward a large round table near the back. I saw Ethan before he saw me. He was wearing a charcoal suit and a pale blue shirt. Natalie sat beside him in a fitted emerald dress, her hair styled as though she'd come directly from a professional salon. Neither of them looked dressed for a casual family dinner. Then I noticed the other people. 2 couples I vaguely recognized from Ethan's social circle sat across the table. And beside Ethan was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, with silver beginning at his temples. I knew his face from Charlotte business publications. Bradley Sutton. Bradley had built a reputation investing in commercial developments throughout the Carolinas. I stopped walking for half a second. Ethan finally noticed me. "Mom." He stood and kissed my cheek. "You made it. I thought this was family dinner." His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "It is. Mostly." A few friends joined us. There was that word again. Mostly. He placed a hand behind my chair. "Mom, this is Bradley Sutton." Bradley stood. "Mrs. Crawford. Nice to meet you. Florence, please." His handshake was firm but warm. "I've heard quite a bit about your son." "I imagine you have." Ethan laughed louder than necessary. I sat down. Within 10 minutes, I understood exactly what the evening was. Ethan wasn't having dinner. He was performing. He talked about his development company, Crawford Urban Partners, as though it were weeks away from transforming Charlotte's skyline. He mentioned a mixed-use development south of the city, then another project involving luxury townhomes. Bradley listened more than he spoke. I knew that type. Richard had been the same way around people asking him for money. The less Richard said, the more carefully he was evaluating them. At one point, Ethan leaned back and said, "We're positioned for serious expansion. It's really about bringing the right capital partner in now." There it was, capital partner. I looked at Bradley, then at Ethan. Suddenly my invitation made sense. Ethan wanted Bradley's money. What I didn't yet understand was why he needed me there. The waiter poured wine. Natalie raised her glass. To new opportunities. Everyone joined her except me. I took a sip of water. Bradley noticed. "You don't drink, Florence, occasionally. I prefer knowing what people are saying around me." Bradley smiled. Ethan didn't. The conversation moved toward family. That was when I discovered my role in Ethan's performance. Bradley asked how long Ethan had lived in Charlotte. "All my life," Ethan said. "Family keeps me here." Natalie touched his arm. "Ethan's incredibly loyal to family." One of their friends nodded. "He really is." I almost smiled. It sounded rehearsed. Then Ethan gestured toward me, especially since Dad passed. I've had to step up quite a bit. My fingers tightened around my water glass. Bradley looked at me. "I'm sorry about your husband." "Thank you. Richard was a good man." "The best," Ethan said quickly. "But after he died, Mom had a hard time managing everything." I turned toward him. "Did I?" He ignored the question. "Bills, house maintenance, finances. You know how it gets when someone has relied on their spouse for decades." I stared at my son. I had never relied on Richard to manage our finances. We had managed them together. Natalie sighed sympathetically. "Florence has been through so much. It was extraordinary how easily someone could make an insult sound compassionate." Bradley looked from Natalie to me. "You've stayed in your home, yes," Ethan answered at the same time. "For now." I slowly turned toward him. For now, he picked up his wine. "We've talked about simplifying." "No, Ethan. You've talked about simplifying." A brief silence fell over the table. Natalie gave a nervous laugh. "Families. We all have these conversations eventually. I could have challenged them then. Instead, I watched. Years in business had taught me something useful. When people believed you were powerless, they often became careless. So I let Ethan talk, and he did. He talked about responsibility, sacrifice, taking care of aging parents. Every sentence made him look generous and made me look increasingly helpless. Then I noticed a man near the bar. He appeared to be in his mid-50s, tall, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair. He wore a dark suit without a tie and moved through the restaurant with the confidence of someone who didn't need to ask permission. He was speaking to a server when he glanced toward our table. His eyes landed on me. He stopped, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed. The server said something to him. The man didn't respond immediately. He kept looking at me. I looked behind myself, wondering if someone else had caught his attention. No one. When I turned back, he was still staring. Ethan noticed too. He leaned toward Natalie. "That's Henry Whitmore, the owner," she whispered. Ethan nodded. Then he glanced at me and smirked. "Maybe he's worried Mom wandered into the wrong section." Natalie covered a laugh with her napkin. I heard every word. So did Bradley. His expression hardened slightly. I said nothing, but I looked at Henry again. Something about his face bothered me. Not because he seemed unfriendly, because he seemed familiar. His jaw, the shape of his eyes, a certain crease between his eyebrows. I had seen those features somewhere before, but on an older face. Henry finally looked away when a manager approached him. I tried to return my attention to dinner. Then Bradley turned toward me. "What did you do before retirement, Florence?" I opened my mouth. Before I could answer, Ethan leaned forward. "Mom!" He laughed dismissively. "She just worked in restaurants. Just one word. 30 years of my life disappeared inside it." And from across the dining room, I saw Henry Whitmore turn toward our table again. This time, he started walking. "Mom doesn't have much left. She just worked in restaurants." Ethan said it with the casual confidence of someone summarizing a summer job. For a moment, I didn't recognize my own son. 33 years of negotiations, openings, restructurings, payroll crises, vendor disputes, and expansion plans had been compressed into 5 dismissive words. Bradley Sutton didn't laugh. Instead, he looked directly at me. What kind of restaurant work? I appreciated the question. Before I could answer, Ethan reached for his wine. "Management stuff, operations, nothing glamorous." "Operations can be pretty important," Bradley said. "Oh, sure." Ethan smiled. "But Mom never cared much about the business side." I felt something cold settle inside me. That wasn't a misunderstanding. Ethan knew better. He had grown up watching me leave the house before sunrise to oversee restaurant openings. He remembered nights when Richard cooked dinner because I was negotiating contracts. As a teenager, he'd complained that I spent too much time traveling between locations. He knew I'd had a career. He was choosing to make it smaller, and I was beginning to understand why. The version of Florence Crawford sitting at Ethan's table wasn't supposed to be competent. She was supposed to be dependent. Bradley looked at me again. "Did you enjoy it very much?" Ethan chuckled. "Mom likes to make it sound more exciting than it was." I turned toward him. "Do I?" Our eyes met. For the first time that evening, his confidence flickered, only for a second. Then Natalie stepped in. Florence has always been very independent. Her voice carried that polished sweetness I'd learned to distrust. But after Richard passed, things changed. I put down my fork. "What things?" Natalie looked at Ethan. He answered. "Mom, come on. We don't have to pretend. Pretend what that things haven't been difficult." The table became quieter. I could hear silverware clinking at nearby tables. Ethan leaned toward Bradley as though he were about to share something painfully personal. Dad handled a lot. When he died, Mom wasn't really prepared. I stared at him. Richard would have laughed at the absurdity. I had known the balances in our accounts down to the dollar. I had reviewed investment statements with him every quarter. There were properties Richard wouldn't buy until I had reviewed the numbers. But Ethan wasn't speaking to me. He was speaking to Bradley. Building a character, the devoted son, the vulnerable mother, the burden he carried with dignity. Bradley asked carefully. Financially, Ethan gave a reluctant-looking shrug, among other things. That performance irritated me more than the lie. He wanted to look embarrassed to reveal my supposed difficulties while making absolutely certain everyone heard them. "Ethan," I said quietly. He glanced at me. "You might want to think carefully about what you're saying." His jaw tightened. Then he smiled. "See, Mom hates talking about money." Natalie touched my arm. I moved my hand before she could reach it. "There's nothing shameful about struggling, Florence." "I didn't say there was." "Exactly," Ethan said. "That's what I've been trying to tell her." One of the other guests suddenly became fascinated by his plate. Another took a long drink of wine. Bradley simply watched. Ethan continued. "Mom doesn't have much left." There it was. The sentence from the hook of my humiliation, spoken casually over an expensive dinner. For several seconds, nobody said anything. I could feel heat climbing into my cheeks, not because I was ashamed of being poor. There would have been no shame in that. I was ashamed that my own son believed my dignity was something he could spend to improve his image. Ethan apparently mistook my silence for permission. "The house is really more than she needs anyway," he continued. "Natalie and I have been looking at some communities." I turned toward Natalie. "Communities." She gave me an encouraging smile. "Senior living, nothing depressing. There are some lovely affordable places outside Charlotte." "You've been looking at places for me to live. We're just thinking ahead. I didn't ask you to." Ethan sighed. "Mom, that's why families plan before there's a crisis." "What crisis?" He didn't answer. Bradley's expression had changed. When I first arrived, he'd looked at Ethan like a businessman evaluating another businessman. Now he was studying him, like a man discovering a flaw in a foundation. Then I remembered Henry Whitmore. I glanced toward the bar. He was no longer there. For a strange second, I felt disappointed. Maybe I had imagined his interest. Then a voice came from behind me. "Excuse me?" Ethan straightened immediately. Henry Whitmore stood beside our table. Up close, the familiarity was stronger. The eyes. That was it. Gray-blue, deep-set with heavy brows. I had known someone with those eyes. Henry barely looked at Ethan. His attention remained fixed on me. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner." Ethan rose halfway from his chair. "Mr. Whitmore, Ethan Crawford. We've actually been meaning to introduce ourselves." Henry nodded politely. "Yes, good evening." Ethan extended his hand. Henry shook it briefly. "This is my wife Natalie and Bradley Sutton." Henry acknowledged them. Then his gaze returned to me. For the first time I saw emotion in his face, not pity, not curiosity, disbelief. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "forgive me, but is your name Crawford?" My heartbeat changed. "Yes, Florence Crawford." Ethan looked at me. Natalie's smile disappeared. "Yes," I said again. Henry inhaled sharply. Then he smiled. It wasn't the professional smile of a restaurant owner greeting a customer. It was warm, almost relieved. "Mrs. Crawford," he said, "is that really you?" The entire table went silent. I searched his face. Then something clicked. Not Henry, someone else. A cramped little restaurant nearly 3 decades earlier. A desperate owner sitting across from Richard and me after closing time. Those same eyes, only older. "Whitmore," I whispered. Henry's smile widened. "My father was George Whitmore." I felt the air leave my lungs. George. Suddenly, the elegant dining room around me seemed to disappear. I could see cracked vinyl booths, an outdated menu, a stack of unpaid supplier invoices, Richard sitting beside me with his sleeves rolled up, and George Whitmore saying he had 3 weeks before he would have to close his doors. I looked around at the polished wood-white tablecloths and crowded dining room, then back at Henry. "George was your father." "Yes, ma'am." His voice softened. "And he talked about you and Richard until the day he died." Beside me, Ethan stopped smiling. What exactly did she do? Henry slowly turned toward my son, and judging by the expression on his face, Ethan was about to learn that she just worked in restaurants was not quite the story his mother had lived. The Whitmore name. Henry looked at Ethan for a moment before answering. "What did your mother do?" There was something almost incredulous in his voice. Then he turned back to me. "Mrs. Crawford, do you mind if I sit down, please?" A server immediately brought another chair. Henry sat beside me while Ethan leaned forward with an expression I knew well. It was the look he wore whenever he realized there was important information in a room that he didn't possess. Henry smiled. "My father would have given anything to see you sitting here." I swallowed. "When did George pass 4 years ago?" "I'm sorry, he had a good life." Henry glanced around the restaurant. "A much better one because of you and your husband." Ethan shifted in his chair. "I'm confused." Henry looked at him. "Your mother never told you." Told me what I answered quietly. There wasn't much to tell. Henry laughed once. "That's exactly what Dad said you'd say." The comment made me smile despite myself. Suddenly I was remembering George Whitmore as he had been 27 years earlier. His restaurant wasn't called Whitmore and Stone then. It was simply Whitmore's Grill, a 48-seat neighborhood restaurant tucked into a strip center outside Charlotte. George had been a gifted cook. He had also been a terrible businessman. When I first saw his books, I couldn't understand how he'd survived as long as he had. Food costs were uncontrolled, his menu was too large. 3 suppliers were charging him different prices for the same products. Employee scheduling was chaotic, and George had signed a lease he barely understood. Richard knew him through a commercial real estate contact. One night Richard came home and said, "Florence, I met a man today who makes the best pork chop I've had in North Carolina and is about 3 weeks from losing his restaurant. That sounds like a dangerous combination. He needs someone who understands operations. So you volunteered me." Richard grinned. "I volunteered dinner." That was how it began. I visited George's restaurant the following Tuesday, then Wednesday, then nearly every evening for 2 weeks. I went through invoices, cut menu items that weren't profitable, renegotiated supplier arrangements, reworked staffing, changed portions, helped George understand that a busy dining room didn't automatically mean a profitable restaurant. "You did all that?" Bradley asked. I had almost forgotten the others were listening. "Yes." Henry shook his head. "She did more than that." Ethan's eyes moved between us. "What do you mean?" Henry folded his hands. "Dad was already behind on rent. He couldn't get another bank loan. Everyone thought the restaurant was finished. I remembered that night. George sitting at a back table after closing, his face in his hands, Richard beside me. George had said I can cook. That's all I know how to do. I told him, then cook. Let us help with what you don't know," Henry continued. "Your parents invested in him." Ethan looked at me sharply. "You gave him money?" "It wasn't a gift. How much?" I ignored the question. Richard and I had reviewed George's numbers after the operational changes. The business was improving, but he needed time, so we provided capital in exchange for an ownership interest. It wasn't reckless, it wasn't charity. It was an investment in a business we believed could survive. Henry smiled at me. "Dad used to say everyone else saw a failing restaurant. You saw what it could become." That sounds like George exaggerating. He wasn't. Henry gestured around us. The original restaurant survived. Then came the second location. Then the third. I looked around the dining room again. George did all this with a lot of help. But yes, for the first time that evening, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt proud. Not because I could claim responsibility for what the Whitmores had built. I couldn't. George had done the hard work. But Richard and I had been there when someone needed a chance. Ethan interrupted. "So Mom still owns part of this restaurant?" His question came so quickly that Bradley lowered his eyes. Henry noticed too. "Not exactly." Ethan leaned closer. "What does that mean?" I knew what Henry was about to explain. Over the years, the original structure had changed. As George expanded, some operating interests had been bought out or reorganized. Richard and I had chosen not to take cash for everything. Instead, a portion of our interest had been rolled into a company holding several pieces of commercial property associated with the expanding business. Crawford Whitmore Properties. I hadn't thought much about the name in years because Rebecca Lawson handled most of the administrative work. Henry looked at me. Do you still receive the quarterly reports? The table went completely silent. Ethan turned toward me. What quarterly reports? I took a sip of water. Yes, Henry. Rebecca still sends them. Rebecca, my attorney. Ethan stared at me. You have an attorney handling this? I have an attorney handling several things. Natalie leaned forward. How often do you get these reports quarterly? I said. Her smile tightened. Henry chuckled softly. Dad always admired that about you. What you never cared whether anyone knew. I looked down at my hands. Richard had been the same. Success to us had never meant convincing a room that we were successful. It meant sleeping well, paying people fairly, owning more than we owed, helping when we could. Ethan had grown up surrounded by those values. Somewhere along the way, he had started measuring life differently. He cleared his throat. So what exactly is Mom's interest worth? Henry's expression changed. The warmth disappeared. That would be a question for your mother. I'm her son. Yes. Henry said the word calmly, but that doesn't make it my information to share. Bradley leaned back slightly. I saw the faintest hint of approval in his expression. Ethan looked at me. Mom, why have I never heard about any of this? There were several answers I could have given, because you never asked about my work, because you assumed Dad had handled everything, because whenever I tried to talk about the past, you changed the subject to yourself. Instead, I said because it wasn't relevant to how I wanted to live. Ethan laughed nervously. You let me think you were struggling. No. I held his gaze. You decided I was struggling. That silenced him. Henry rose. I should let you finish dinner. Then he paused. Actually, Mrs. Crawford, there's something in my office that belongs with you. I frowned. What? He smiled. I'll bring it out. As Henry walked away, Ethan watched him. Then he turned toward me. His expression was different now. The embarrassment he'd shown earlier was gone. So was the patronizing concern. In its place was something much more focused. Calculation. And for the first time that evening, I realized Henry Whitmore's recognition of me hadn't merely embarrassed my son. It had made him curious about exactly how much his supposedly broke mother might actually have. The envelope Henry was gone for less than 5 minutes. It was long enough for Ethan to ask me 3 questions about money. So how long have you had this investment? Years. How much does it pay? Enough. And you've never thought to mention it. I folded my napkin beside my plate. I didn't realize I was required to submit financial reports to my son. That's not what I mean. It sounds remarkably close. Natalie gave a soft laugh that didn't reach her eyes. Florence, Ethan's only surprised. We thought things had been difficult for you. There was that word again. We. As though my financial decline had been a family fact discussed everywhere except with me. You thought I said. You never asked. Ethan leaned back. I did ask. No, you offered to take over. That's different. Bradley remained silent, but I could feel him listening. The waiter approached to clear the plates, and Ethan immediately reached toward the leather folder in the man's hand. I'll take the check. The waiter hesitated. There isn't one, sir. Ethan smiled. I reserved the table. Yes, sir, but Mr. Whitmore asked that tonight's dinner be placed on the hospitality account. Ethan glanced toward me. I could almost see the explanation forming in his mind. Henry felt sorry for the supposedly poor widow. Well, Ethan said, please, that's very generous of him. The waiter started to leave. Which hospitality account? Bradley asked. The young man checked the folder. Crawford Whitmore Properties. Ethan's smile disappeared. I'm sorry. Before the waiter could answer, Henry returned. He carried a cream-colored envelope. Ethan stood. Henry, the waiter, said something about Crawford Whitmore Properties. Yes. What exactly is that? Henry pulled out the empty chair beside me again. A holding company. For the restaurants. Not the restaurant operations themselves. It owns interests in several properties connected to them. Ethan looked at me. And Mom owns that. Henry answered carefully. Your mother has an interest in it. How much, Ethan? My voice was quiet. He turned toward me. What? I'm just trying to understand. No, you're trying to calculate. His face reddened. That isn't fair. Less than an hour earlier, he had told strangers I had almost nothing left. Now he was offended because I wouldn't disclose my assets on command. Henry placed the envelope in front of me. This came to my office earlier in the week. Normally it would have been forwarded, but since you're here, I thought I'd save Rebecca the trouble. I looked at my name written neatly across the front. Florence Crawford. I opened it. Inside was a quarterly distribution statement and a check. I had barely pulled the papers halfway out when Ethan leaned toward me. "Let me see." His hand moved toward the envelope. Mine covered it first. It was a small gesture, but everyone at the table noticed. Ethan froze. "I was just helping. I don't need help reading my name." Natalie looked away. Bradley lowered his wineglass. Henry remained expressionless. I unfolded the statement enough to recognize the document, then returned it to the envelope without displaying the figures. Ethan stared. "How much is the check?" I looked at him. "Why?" "Because I'm your son." That still isn't an answer. "Mom, stop making this weird." I almost laughed. I was the one making it weird. He had announced my supposed poverty to a table of strangers, discussed moving me into affordable senior housing, and now wanted to inspect my private financial statement before dessert. Henry cleared his throat. "Mrs. Crawford's original investment was restructured years ago. Her current interest is tied primarily to the property company." Bradley nodded. "Commercial real estate?" "Yes, Charlotte mostly." Bradley looked impressed. Ethan noticed. That seemed to bother him more than anything. "How valuable are those properties?" he asked. Henry's expression hardened. "That's not information I'm going to discuss without your mother's permission. I'm family, and she's the owner." The sentence landed harder than Henry probably intended. For years, Ethan had treated me as though being my son automatically made him my representative. Henry had just reminded him that it didn't. I slid the envelope into my handbag. Ethan watched every movement. Then he said, "I really don't understand why you've kept all this secret." "I haven't kept it secret. I didn't know about it. Those are not the same thing." He shook his head. "You've been driving that old Toyota." "I like my Toyota. You stopped traveling. I stopped enjoying traveling alone. You shop at ordinary stores." I stared at him. What stores should a financially secure widow shop at? Ethan Bradley coughed, disguising a laugh. Ethan ignored him. "You let Natalie and me worry about you." I felt something inside me finally sharpen. "Were you worried?" He blinked. "Of course." "Then why did you tell everyone tonight that I was broke?" Silence. Ethan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "You didn't pull me aside," I continued. "You didn't ask whether I needed help. You announced my supposed financial problems in front of a man you're trying to impress." Bradley's eyes shifted toward Ethan. That was when Ethan realized I had understood the purpose of the dinner. "Mom, Bradley is a friend." Bradley finally spoke. "We've met 4 times. Natalie stared down at her plate. I almost felt sorry for Ethan. Almost. Henry stood. "I should get back to the dining room." I touched his arm. "Henry." He looked down. "Thank you for remembering Richard." His expression softened. "I couldn't forget either of you if I tried." He walked away. Dessert menus arrived, but nobody opened them. The mood had changed completely. Earlier, Ethan had occupied the center of the table. Now he seemed smaller. But I didn't feel victorious. He was still my son. Watching him humiliate himself gave me no pleasure. I wanted the evening to end. Outside, Ethan insisted on walking me to my car. When we reached the Toyota, he stared at it as though seeing it for the first time. "Mom, yes, how much money do you actually have?" There it was. Not "Why didn't I know about your career?" Not "Why didn't Dad ever tell me about George Whitmore?" Not even "Did I hurt you tonight?" Money. I unlocked my car. Enough to live the life I choose. He stepped closer. "You know that's not what I'm asking." "I know exactly what you're asking." I opened the door. His voice softened suddenly. "If you're managing investments like that alone, maybe I should look over everything just to make sure nobody's taking advantage of you." I studied his face. An hour ago, I had been the broke mother he needed to support. Now I was the vulnerable investor he needed to protect. The story had changed. His objective hadn't. "I have Rebecca," I said. "An attorney isn't family." "No." I got into the car. "But she doesn't ask how much I'm worth 5 minutes after discovering I have something." Ethan stepped back. I drove home with Henry's envelope beside me. I thought that was the end of an ugly evening. I was wrong. The next afternoon, Henry Whitmore called me, and what he told me made the humiliation at dinner seem almost insignificant. Ethan had contacted him months before, and he'd done it using my name. Suddenly, my son was worried about me. The morning after dinner, Ethan called before 9. I was standing at the kitchen counter pouring coffee when his name appeared on my phone. For a second, I considered letting it ring, then I answered. "Good morning, Mom. I've been thinking about last night, so have I. I feel terrible. That surprised me." I waited. I shouldn't have let you leave without talking through those investments. And there it was. Not the apology I had hoped for. Those investments? Yes, the Whitmore thing. If you've got money tied up in commercial property, that's complicated, especially at your age. I looked at Richard's old coffee mug in the cabinet. At my age. 24 hours earlier, Ethan had been comfortable presenting me as nearly penniless. Now that he'd discovered I had assets, my age had suddenly become a financial emergency. "I've managed," I said. "That's what worries me. You shouldn't have to manage alone. I don't. Rebecca is a lawyer. A very good one, but she's not family." I nearly smiled. He had used the same line in the parking lot. "Ethan, I'm having coffee." "Okay, we'll talk later." It wasn't a question. He called again that afternoon, then the following morning. By Tuesday, my son had shown more interest in my financial life than he had in the previous 6 years. He asked about property taxes, insurance, investment accounts, Richard's estate, whether I still had a mortgage, whether my will was current. Each question was wrapped in concern. Each one pointed toward the same destination: money. Natalie joined in. She came by Wednesday carrying blueberry muffins from a bakery I liked. That alone should have warned me. Natalie had visited my house twice in the previous 3 months. Now she was standing in my kitchen asking whether I'd considered putting the house into a trust. "Estate planning can get so messy," she said. "I have an estate plan." "Oh." She took a careful bite of muffin. "Does Ethan know what's in it, no?" Her eyebrows lifted. Really, but he's your only child, yes. Wouldn't it make sense for him to understand what he'll eventually be responsible for?" I set down my coffee. "Eventually responsible for and eventually inherit are two different things." Natalie smiled. "Of course." But her face had tightened. Then she asked, "Does Crawford Whitmore Properties pass directly to Ethan?" I looked at her for several seconds. She realized she'd gone too far. "I just mean from a tax perspective. Are you suddenly an estate attorney?" She laughed. "No. Then let's leave that question to Rebecca." Natalie didn't stay long after that. By Friday, I was no longer confused. I was disappointed. I had wanted Ethan to call and say, "Mom, I'm sorry I embarrassed you." Instead, he'd called to ask whether I needed help reviewing financial statements. I had wanted Natalie to acknowledge that discussing senior housing without me had been insulting. Instead, she'd asked about my trust. Money hadn't changed them in a week. It had revealed what they were paying attention to. That afternoon, my phone rang again. I expected Ethan. The screen showed an unfamiliar local number. "Hello, Mrs. Crawford. This is Henry Whitmore." His voice immediately brought me back to the restaurant. "Henry, hello. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." He hesitated. "I wanted to speak with you privately." Something in his tone made me sit down. "About what, your son?" My stomach tightened. "What about Ethan?" Henry paused again. I debated whether this was my business. But after watching what happened at dinner, I don't think I'd feel right keeping it from you. I said nothing. A few months ago, Ethan contacted me. My fingers tightened around the phone. "About what?" "One of the properties held through Crawford Whitmore." I sat straighter. "Which property?" "The South End parcel." I knew it. The land had become significantly more valuable as Charlotte expanded. What did Ethan want? He asked whether we'd consider selling. My confusion turned immediately to alarm. "Why would he ask you that?" "That was my question." Henry's voice became careful. "He said he was exploring options on your behalf." I stopped breathing for a second. "My behalf?" "Yes, those were his words." "Not exactly. He said he was representing his mother's interests." I stood up without realizing it. He said what I asked, whether he had authority to discuss the property. He said it was a family matter and that you were beginning to let him handle more of your financial affairs. My kitchen suddenly felt too small. I never told him that. I suspected something was off. That's why I didn't go any further. "Did he send you anything?" "Not to me personally. He mentioned paperwork could be provided if discussions became serious." I walked toward the window. Outside, a neighbor was pushing a stroller down the sidewalk. Everything looked completely ordinary. Inside my house, something had shifted. How long ago? About 4 months. 4 months, long before the dinner. Long before Ethan supposedly discovered I still had money connected to the Whitmores. That realization frightened me more than anything Henry had said. If Ethan believed I was broke, why had he already been asking about selling property connected to my investments unless he knew more than he had admitted? "Did you speak again twice?" And the second time he was more insistent. I closed my eyes. "What did he say? That you were overwhelmed since Richard's death? That financial decisions had become difficult for you?" My eyes opened. Richard had been dead 6 years. Ethan was using my grief as evidence of incompetence. Henry continued quietly. "I told him any discussion would require authorization directly from you or Rebecca." "Thank you." "Mrs. Crawford, I'm sorry. You didn't do anything wrong. I should have contacted you sooner." "Maybe." I wasn't angry with him. I was trying to understand my son. After we hung up, I remained standing beside the window. Then I remembered something. 3 months earlier, Ethan had come to my house carrying a folder. He'd said there were some insurance documents that needed updated signatures. I had been cooking dinner. He had placed little yellow tabs beside several lines. Just routine paperwork, Mom. I hadn't signed them. Something had distracted us, and Ethan took the folder home. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now my hands felt cold. I walked into my study and opened the filing cabinet Richard and I had used for years. The Crawford Whitmore documents were exactly where they belonged. I pulled out Rebecca Lawson's business card. For several seconds, I stared at her number. Part of me wanted to call Ethan first, to demand an explanation, but another voice stopped me. Richard's voice. Whenever something went wrong in business, he used to say, "Facts first, Florence, feelings second." So I called Rebecca. She answered on the third ring. "Florence, it's been a while. Rebecca, I need you to look into something." Her tone changed immediately. "What happened?" "My son has been telling people he's representing my financial interests." Silence. Then she asked, "Did you authorize him?" "No." "Did you sign anything giving him authority?" "I don't think so." "You don't think so?" I closed my eyes. "Rebecca, that's what I need you to find out. She told me to come to her office Monday morning." I hung up and sat alone at Richard's desk. For the first time since that humiliating dinner, I wasn't angry about being called broke. I was afraid of something much worse. My son hadn't simply misunderstood my life. He might have been trying to gain control of it. The signature I never made, Rebecca Lawson's office, occupied the 7th floor of a quiet building near uptown Charlotte. Richard and I had been going there for almost 18 years. Usually those visits had been uneventful estate planning property documents, contract reviews, the boring but necessary paperwork of a life carefully built. That Monday morning felt different. Rebecca was waiting when I arrived. She was 58, silver beginning to thread through her dark hair, with the calm expression of someone who had spent decades listening to people panic before telling them what actually mattered. She closed her office door. "Start from the beginning." I told her everything. The dinner. Ethan announcing that I was broke. Henry recognizing me. The quarterly distribution. Ethan's sudden interest in my investments. Natalie's questions about my trust. And finally, Henry's phone call. Rebecca didn't interrupt until I mentioned the South End property. Ethan specifically asked about selling it. "Yes." "Did you ever discuss that property with him?" "Not recently." "Did Richard?" "Possibly years ago." But Ethan never cared about those details. Rebecca made a note. "Did you ever give Ethan written authority to negotiate on your behalf? Number, power of attorney, number, limited authorization." "No." "Anything allowing him to represent Crawford Whitmore interests?" "Absolutely not." Rebecca leaned back. "Then we need to find out what he presented." She made several calls. One was to Henry. Another was to the administrative office handling Crawford Whitmore properties. The third lasted longer. I sat across from her, watching the Charlotte skyline through the window. 20 minutes later, Rebecca ended the call and looked at me. "There is something." My stomach tightened. "What a broker received a letter approximately 14 weeks ago. From Ethan, from someone at his company." Rebecca turned her monitor toward me. The broker forwarded a copy. A document appeared on the screen. At the top were the words, "Family Authorization Letter." Below that was my full name, Florence Crawford. I leaned closer. The letter stated that Ethan Crawford was authorized to participate in preliminary discussions involving certain family-held commercial assets. It didn't grant him the legal power to sell anything. It didn't transfer ownership. But it created the impression that I had asked him to speak for me. Then I reached the bottom. My name appeared again, and underneath it was a signature. I stared. Rebecca didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "That isn't mine." "You're certain?" I almost laughed. "Rebecca, I've been signing my name for more than 60 years. She enlarged it. The signature was good, very good. Someone had copied the long upward stroke of my F and the slight break I usually made between Crawford's W and F. But one detail was wrong, the final D. I always curved it backward. Richard used to tease me that my signature looked unfinished. This one didn't. That's not my signature. Rebecca's face became still. "Did you ever sign a blank page for Ethan or any document he might have attached this page to?" "I don't know." The answer frightened me. Then I remembered that folder. Wait. Rebecca looked up. "A few months ago, Ethan brought paperwork to my house." "What paperwork?" He said insurance documents, maybe tax-related. I was making dinner. "Did you sign anything?" "I don't think so." "You need to be certain." I closed my eyes and tried to reconstruct the evening. Ethan at the kitchen island. A blue folder, yellow tabs, a pen. He had said, "Just sign where I marked Mom." I remembered picking up the pen. Then the oven timer went off. I had put the pen down. Later, Ethan took the folder with him. "No," I said finally. I didn't sign. Rebecca exhaled. "Good, but he wanted me to." Yes. The words sat heavily between us. I looked back at the authorization letter. Can this document sell the property? No. Can it transfer my ownership? No. Then why make it? Rebecca folded her hands. Credibility. I frowned. If Ethan approaches a broker saying he's negotiating for his elderly mother, they may ask whether he has authority. This letter gives him something to show. But eventually they'd need me. Eventually. That word made my skin crawl. Rebecca continued. Think of it as opening a door. It doesn't let him complete the transaction, but it may allow conversations to begin without anyone contacting you immediately. I stood and walked toward the window. He forged my name. We don't yet know who physically created the signature. I turned. You think someone else did it? I'm saying we document facts before making accusations. Richard's rule again. Facts first, feelings second. What do we do? First protect you. Rebecca began listing steps. Written notice to Crawford Whitmore Management, written notice to relevant brokers, confirmation that no one except me or Rebecca had authority to issue instructions, review of property records, review of estate documents, review of any authorization Ethan might previously have requested. Then she said, I also want you to check your financial accounts. Ethan doesn't have access. Check anyway. I nodded. My anger was beginning to replace fear. I want to confront him. Rebecca shook her head. Not yet. Why? Because we don't know what he was trying to accomplish. He wanted the property sold. Maybe. She tapped the letter. But this document only starts a conversation. Why start it? I sat down again. I hadn't asked myself that. Rebecca continued. Is Ethan's business doing well as far as I know? As far as you know? The distinction bothered me. I thought about the dinner, the expensive suit, the wine, the talk about expansion. Bradley Sutton, capital partner. Suddenly details that had seemed merely arrogant felt connected. Rebecca. Yes, could Ethan be in financial trouble? I don't know. Can we find out some of it? Commercial filings, liens, property records, anything public, and I can ask questions without making noise. I looked at the signature again. My son's name was printed directly above mine. For years, I had assumed Ethan's worst flaw was vanity. I had watched him chase appearances and quietly hoped age would teach him what Richard and I had failed to. But vanity was one thing. Using my name was another. Rebecca printed the letter and placed it in a folder. Florence, until we know more, don't sign anything Ethan brings you. I won't. Don't tell him what we found. That was harder. You want me to pretend everything is normal? I want you to let him show us what he intends to do next. I hated the idea, but I understood it. As I left Rebecca's office, my phone vibrated. Ethan. I stared at his name, then answered. Hi, sweetheart. His voice was unusually cheerful. Mom, I was thinking maybe we could sit down this week and go over some financial planning. I looked through the glass doors of Rebecca's office. She was standing inside watching me. What kind of planning? I asked. Oh, nothing serious, Ethan said. Just family stuff, family stuff. I tightened my grip on the phone. All right, I said softly. We'll talk. For the first time, I wasn't wondering whether my son wanted something from me. I knew he did. The only question left was how much he was willing to take. Why Ethan needed my money. Rebecca called me 2 days later. Florence, can you come in this afternoon? There was no warmth in her voice, no small talk. I knew immediately that she had found something. I can be there at 2. Good. And don't mention this meeting to Ethan. At exactly 2, I was sitting across from her again. This time, 3 folders were waiting on the desk. Rebecca touched the first. Your accounts are fine. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. No unauthorized withdrawals. No new liens against your house. No changes to the ownership records we've reviewed, and Crawford Whitmore protected. I've sent formal notices confirming that only you or I may authorize discussions involving your interest. That should have made me feel safe. Instead, I looked at the other folders. What did you find about Ethan? Rebecca paused. His company is in trouble. 3 simple words. I felt my stomach drop. How much trouble? Potentially serious. She opened the second folder. Crawford Urban Partners had 2 projects that had performed far below projections. One was a townhouse development outside Charlotte where construction costs had risen while sales slowed. The other was a mixed-use project Ethan had described at dinner as one of his great successes. It wasn't. The project had exceeded its budget and was carrying expensive debt. He made it sound like everything was booming. He needed Bradley Sutton to believe that. I stared at the figures. How much does he owe? Rebecca named an amount. I leaned back. It wasn't enough to make Ethan one of the biggest failures in Charlotte real estate, but it was enough to destroy the life he had built if several things went wrong at once. There's more, Rebecca said. Of course there was. A commercial loan is approaching maturity. When soon? And if he can't refinance, he'll need capital and other investor asset sales or some combination. Bradley. Suddenly, that dinner made perfect sense. The expensive restaurant, the carefully chosen guests, the talk about growth, the performance of success. Ethan hadn't been celebrating. He had been auditioning for rescue. Does Bradley know I can't tell you what Ethan disclosed privately? But if Ethan presented the company the way he did at dinner. Rebecca nodded. He may not have presented the whole picture. I thought about my son laughing over wine while describing future projects. Then another thought occurred to me. The South End property. Rebecca opened the third folder. Yes. How much is it worth? She gave me a conservative estimate. I stared at her. If my interest in that property were liquidated, it could cover a significant portion of the hole Ethan was trying to fill. Not all of it. Enough to buy him time. Enough to make his company look healthier. Enough perhaps to persuade someone like Bradley Sutton to step in. So that's why. It's a strong possibility. I stood and walked toward the window. Below us, cars moved through the city like pieces on a board. He was going to sell something that wasn't his. He couldn't legally complete a sale without further authority, but he was trying to get that authority. Rebecca didn't answer. She didn't need to. I remembered Ethan sitting at my kitchen island with the blue folder. Just routine paperwork, Mom. Sign where I marked. My stomach turned. What would have happened if I'd signed whatever he brought? We don't know what those documents were, but we know what he wanted. We're beginning to. I closed my eyes. For one painful moment, Ethan wasn't 42. He was 7, running into my kitchen with a scraped knee. He was 12, pretending not to cry when Richard left him at summer camp. He was 18, hugging me before leaving for college. I had loved every version of that boy. How had we arrived here? I would have helped him, I whispered. Rebecca looked at me. If he had come to me and said he was in trouble, I would have listened. That doesn't mean you would have written a check. No. But I would have listened. That was the part that hurt most. Ethan hadn't trusted me enough to tell me he was failing. Instead, he'd tried to make me look incapable so he could become the person speaking for me. Rebecca closed the folder. Florence, there's something else you need to understand. I sat down. What the story he's been telling about you may serve a purpose. What story? That you're struggling financially, that you're overwhelmed, that Richard handled everything, that Ethan has had to step in. My skin prickled. You think that's connected? Imagine you're a broker investor or business partner. Ethan tells you his widowed mother is aging confused about finances and increasingly dependent on him. Then he produces an authorization document saying he's helping manage family assets. I felt cold. They'd believe him. Some might. Suddenly, the humiliation at Whitmore and Stone looked different. I had thought Ethan called me broke because he wanted Bradley to see him as generous. Maybe that had been part of it, but the lie did something else. It established a narrative. Florence Crawford couldn't manage money. Florence Crawford depended on her son. Florence Crawford needed Ethan to handle things. And the more people heard it, the less strange it would seem when Ethan eventually appeared carrying documents. I thought of Natalie talking about senior housing. Was that part of it too? I didn't know. And I refused to invent guilt where I didn't have evidence. But I knew enough. What do you recommend? Protect everything first. Already done. Yes. Next, don't confront him yet. I looked sharply at her. Again, let him make the next move. I hated that advice, but I knew she was right. That evening, Ethan called. His voice was warm. Mom, how are you feeling? Fine. Good. Natalie and I were talking. We really should sit down as a family. About your future, the house, investments, making things easier. I sat in Richard's chair. When next week, maybe. Who would be there? Just us. Then he paused. Possibly Bradley. I nearly laughed. Why would Bradley Sutton need to discuss my future? Well, not your future exactly. There are some opportunities where family assets could help strengthen the business. There it was. Not all of it. But enough. I let silence stretch between us. Mom, I heard you. I just want us all protected. I looked at the framed photograph of Richard. Facts first, feeling second. All right, Ethan. His relief was immediate. Really, yes. Set up the meeting. After we hung up, I called Rebecca. He made his next move, and this time I wasn't going to let my son tell the room who Florence Crawford was. I was going to let him talk until everyone understood exactly who he had become. I let him believe I knew nothing. Rebecca did not waste time. By Friday morning, every person who needed to know had been formally notified that Ethan Crawford had no authority to represent me, negotiate on my behalf, or make decisions involving my interest in Crawford Whitmore properties. My investment accounts were reviewed, my estate documents were secured, my house records were checked, nothing had been transferred, nothing had been sold, nothing had been stolen. yet. That word mattered. Rebecca kept reminding me that suspicion was not proof of everything I feared. We know he misrepresented his authority, she said. We know there's a questionable signature. We know he's under financial pressure. Beyond that, let him tell us what he wants. So I did something that went against every maternal instinct I had. I acted normal. When Ethan called, I answered. When he asked how I was feeling, I said fine. When he offered to come over and organize some things, I politely declined. And when he talked about our upcoming family meeting, I let him believe I was grateful. He became increasingly affectionate. Love you, Mom. Love you too. You know, I'm just trying to protect you. I know what you're saying. I became very careful with my words. I never told him I trusted him. I never said I agreed with his plans. But Ethan seemed to hear what he wanted. On Saturday, he came by with coffee. He stood in my kitchen wearing expensive sneakers and a smile that reminded me painfully of Richard. For a moment, I wanted to forget everything. Then Ethan glanced toward my study. Have you found the latest statements from that Whitmore company? The feeling disappeared. They're somewhere. You should bring them to the meeting. Why? So we know what we're working with. I stirred my coffee. I thought the meeting was about my future. It is. Then why do you need my investment statements? His expression tightened. Because your financial security affects every decision. You've spent years believing I didn't have financial security. That was before I knew the full picture. At least that was honest. Not intentionally, perhaps, but honest. Money had changed his picture. He left 20 minutes later. The moment his car disappeared, my phone rang. Bradley Sutton. I had given him my number after the restaurant dinner when he'd quietly asked whether he could contact me. Florence, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all. I understand Ethan is arranging another meeting. Yes, he asked me to attend. I wasn't surprised. Did he say why he wants to discuss a possible investment in Crawford Urban Partners? In my presence, Bradley paused. He said there were family assets that could strengthen the company's position. There was the phrase again, family assets, as though decades of Richard's and my work had somehow become a communal emergency fund. What did you tell him that I'd attend? I was quiet. Then Bradley said, I want you to know something. What happened at dinner bothered me. The business discussion, the way he treated you. I looked out my kitchen window. Ethan is under pressure. Pressure doesn't create character, Florence. It reveals it. The words stayed with me. I haven't decided whether to invest, Bradley continued, but I have concerns. Then make your decision based on the business. I will. And based on the man you saw. Silence. Then Bradley said, understood. I didn't ask him to punish Ethan. I didn't ask him to walk away. Whatever happened to my son's company needed to be the consequence of Ethan's choices, not my revenge. After that call, I contacted Henry. I need a favor. Anything. I need a private room. At Whitmore and Stone, yes, when I gave him the date. Henry was quiet for a moment. Is this about Ethan, yes? Do you want me there? Not at first. He understood immediately. I'll make sure you're not disturbed. When I told Ethan I'd arranged the location, he sounded delighted. Perfect. Bradley already likes the place. Yes, I said. I think it's appropriate. He had no idea why. The evening before the meeting, I sat alone in my study. Richard's desk still had a shallow scratch near the corner from when Ethan had dragged a toy truck across it at age 5. I ran my finger over the mark. There was something unbearable about preparing to confront your own child. If Ethan had been a stranger, this would have been easier. I could have been angry without remembering his first day of school. I could have distrusted him without remembering how he held my hand at Richard's funeral. But love doesn't disappear simply because someone disappoints you. Sometimes it makes disappointment sharper. Rebecca had prepared a folder for me. Inside were copies of the authorization letter, property notices, and documents confirming the limits of Ethan's authority. I placed the folder beside Richard's photograph. What would you do? I whispered. Of course, the photograph didn't answer. But I knew Richard. He would have protected what we'd built. And he would have made Ethan face the truth. Not because he hated him, because he loved him too much to finance dishonesty. The next morning, Ethan called. Everything's still good for tomorrow. Yes, you're not nervous, are you? Should I be? He laughed. No, that's why I'm handling it. I closed my eyes, of course. I'll bring the paperwork. What paperwork? Just some documents that will make things easier going forward. There it was again. Documents. What kind? We'll go through everything tomorrow. No need to overwhelm you now. I nearly asked him who he thought he was speaking to. Instead, I said, all right. After we hung up, I called Rebecca. He's bringing documents. So are we. The following evening, I arrived at Whitmore and Stone 20 minutes early. Henry met me near the entrance. He didn't ask questions. He simply touched my shoulder and said, "The private room is ready." I walked inside. The room had one long, polished table, 6 chairs, water glasses, nothing more. I chose the chair facing the door. Then I placed Rebecca's folder on the chair beside me, hidden beneath my handbag. 10 minutes later, Bradley arrived. He greeted me quietly and sat near the end of the table. At 7 sharp, Ethan and Natalie entered. Ethan carried a leather portfolio. The same confident smile from our first dinner had returned. He kissed my cheek. "Thanks for trusting me, Mom." The words hurt more than I expected. I looked at my son and smiled gently. "Why don't you show me what you brought?" Ethan sat down and opened his portfolio. He had no idea Rebecca was waiting nearby. He had no idea Henry had kept records of their earlier conversations. And most importantly, he had no idea that every door leading to my assets had already been locked. All I needed now was for Ethan to explain in his own words why he'd been trying so hard to open them. The papers he wanted me to sign. Ethan arranged the documents on the table with the confidence of a man who believed the meeting was already going his way. Natalie sat beside him. Bradley remained at the far end, silent. I kept my handbag on the empty chair beside me, covering Rebecca's folder. Ethan smiled. "First, Mom, I want you to understand this isn't about taking anything away from you." Interesting opening. I didn't say it was. I know. But financial planning can feel uncomfortable. For whom? He paused. Then Natalie leaned forward. "For everyone, Florence, especially when parents get older." There it was again. Older, not incapable, not incompetent, just old enough that they could make the word do the work. Ethan opened the first document. "I've been worried about you." "Since when?" "For a while." "Before or after Whitmore and Stone?" His jaw tightened. "Before. That's interesting. Why no reason? Continue." Bradley shifted slightly. Ethan glanced toward him before returning to me. "Mom, there have been signs." "What signs?" "Forgetfulness." I almost smiled. "Give me an example," Natalie answered. "Last Christmas you forgot where you put the serving platter." I stared at her. "You mean the platter Richard always kept in the dining room cabinet?" "Yes. I moved it to the pantry after he died." Natalie's cheeks reddened. Ethan jumped in. "That's not the point. Then what's another example?" "You called me twice about the same appointment." "What appointment?" "The dentist." I thought for a moment. "I called once to tell you I'd changed the date and once to tell you the new date." Bradley looked down. Ethan exhaled impatiently. "Mom, you're doing exactly what you always do." "What am I doing arguing every detail? I thought details mattered when you're suggesting someone can't manage her own life." That silenced the room. Ethan's voice softened. "Nobody said you can't manage your life. Not yet." He looked at Natalie. She placed her hand on his arm. Ethan pulled another document from the portfolio. "We're talking about making things easier." He slid it across the table. I didn't touch it. "What is it? A financial power of attorney?" There it was. The document Rebecca had predicted. I looked at Ethan. "And who would be my agent, me?" Of course, his face hardened. "Why are you saying it like that?" "Because you've already been representing yourself as my agent." Natalie's eyes moved quickly toward Ethan. He ignored the comment. "This would simply formalize things. Things I've never agreed to. Mom, that's why we're discussing it." Bradley finally spoke. "Ethan, why am I here?" The question changed the atmosphere. Ethan straightened. "Because this affects the investment structure. What does your mother's power of attorney have to do with my investment?" Ethan hesitated. I watched him carefully. He had prepared for me. He hadn't prepared for Bradley. "Crawford Urban Partners is family-backed," Ethan said. Bradley frowned. "Family-backed how we have access to family assets," I leaned forward. Ethan looked at me. "You know what I mean." "No, explain it, Mom. Explain what family assets your company has access to." His patience cracked. "The Crawford Whitmore interest for one. That belongs to me, obviously." "Then your company doesn't have access to it." "Not currently." The words escaped before he could stop them. Bradley leaned back. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. I felt something painful settle into certainty. "Not currently," I repeated. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" "If we structure things properly, your assets could provide additional security. Bradley sees stronger backing. The company gets better financing options. You get professional management. And what do I get if the company fails?" "It's not going to fail. That's not an answer. Mom, you don't understand how these deals work." I stared at him. For 33 years, I had sat across tables from men who used that exact sentence when they wanted me to stop asking questions. It hadn't worked then. It wasn't going to work now. "I understand collateral." Ethan froze. I continued. "I understand guarantees. I understand leveraged assets. And I understand that you're asking me to give you financial authority while you're trying to convince Bradley that my property stands behind your company. Natalie whispered, Florence, you're making this sound sinister. I turned toward her. Then make it sound innocent. She had no answer. Ethan pushed the document closer. Just read it. I already know what a power of attorney is. You haven't even looked. I don't need to. His voice rose. Why are you being so difficult? Bradley looked at him sharply. I remained calm. Because I have one question. What did you intend to use my assets to secure your business obligations? Ethan stared at me. It's more complicated than that. No, I shook my head. It's actually very simple. He said nothing. I reached for my handbag. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared on his face. I lifted the bag and pulled out Rebecca's folder. Natalie went pale. I opened it. Then I removed a single sheet of paper, the family authorization letter. I placed it on the table beside Ethan's unsigned power of attorney. He stared at it. What is that you tell me? His eyes moved down the page. I watched the exact moment he recognized it. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Bradley leaned forward. What am I looking at? A document sent to a broker 14 weeks ago. I tapped the bottom of the page. It says Ethan was authorized to participate in discussions involving my commercial assets. Ethan looked up. Mom, I can explain. Good. I pointed to the signature. Start there. Natalie whispered his name. He didn't look at her. I turned the paper so Bradley could see it. That signature says Florence Crawford. Then I looked directly into my son's eyes. But I never signed it. The room went completely silent. Ethan's face had lost all color. I pushed his power of attorney back toward him. Before I sign yours, Ethan, maybe you can explain why you already signed mine. For the first time since this nightmare began, my son had nothing to say. And he still didn't know that the two people who could dismantle every excuse he was about to make were waiting just outside that door. The restaurant owner finally spoke. For several seconds, Ethan simply stared at the authorization letter. Then he laughed. It was the wrong kind of laugh. Too quick, too nervous. Mom, you're seriously accusing me of forging your signature. I haven't accused you of anything beyond what I can prove. I tapped the page. This document was submitted under my name. I didn't sign it. Ethan pushed back from the table. Then someone in my office made a mistake. Bradley spoke quietly. What kind of mistake produces someone else's signature? Ethan turned toward him. You know how administrative staff are. Someone probably used an old document or copied something from a file. I felt my stomach turn. He wasn't shocked that my signature had appeared without permission. He was looking for someone to blame. Natalie touched his arm. Ethan, maybe you should explain the context. There's nothing to explain. He looked at me. I was exploring options for you, for me. Yes, you were trying to sell an interest in the South End property for me. I was investigating possibilities. Without telling me, you would have said no before understanding the opportunity. I stared at him. That is what consent looks like, Ethan. I get to say no. His face hardened. This is exactly why I've been worried. You react emotionally to financial decisions. Bradley shifted in his chair. I almost admired the audacity. My son had been confronted with a document bearing a signature I hadn't made, and within minutes he was using my anger as evidence that I shouldn't control my own money. I closed the folder. There's someone I'd like you to speak with. Ethan frowned. Who? The door opened. Rebecca Lawson stepped inside. Ethan's expression changed immediately. He knew her. Rebecca, good evening, Ethan. She carried a slim black portfolio and took the empty chair beside me. What are you doing here representing Florence? I thought this was a family meeting. Rebecca calmly placed her portfolio on the table. It became a legal matter when someone began representing Florence's financial interests without authorization. Ethan looked at me. You brought a lawyer, my lawyer. Rebecca continued before he could respond. I've reviewed Florence's current estate documents, powers of attorney property interests, and relevant authorization records. You have never been granted authority to negotiate on her behalf regarding Crawford Whitmore properties. Ethan pointed at the letter. I already said that may have been an administrative mistake. Then you should determine who made it. Rebecca's tone remained neutral. Because Florence did not sign that document, Natalie's voice was barely audible. Could this become criminal? Rebecca looked at her. That depends on facts we are not going to speculate about tonight. Ethan's anger rose. This is ridiculous. I was trying to help my mother. Bradley finally leaned forward. Then why was the help tied to your company? Ethan turned. It wasn't. You just told me her assets could strengthen your financing position. That doesn't mean I'm stealing from her. No one said stealing, Bradley replied. You did. Ethan realized his mistake. He stood. "I need some air. Sit down, Ethan." My voice surprised even me. He looked at me. Maybe it was the way I said his name. Maybe some part of him remembered that before I became the old woman he thought he could manage, I had been his mother. He sat. I looked toward the door. There's one more person. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Henry Whitmore entered. This time he wasn't smiling. He carried a folder. Ethan whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." Henry took a seat near Bradley. "I wish I were." He opened the folder. "These are notes from conversations I had with Ethan concerning the South End parcel." Ethan immediately objected. "Those were preliminary business discussions." "Yes." Henry looked directly at him. "Discussions you said you were having on your mother's behalf. I said we were discussing things as a family." "No." Henry's voice remained calm. "You said Florence was beginning to struggle with financial decisions since Richard's death." I felt the words strike differently hearing them in front of everyone. Henry continued, "You told me you were gradually taking responsibility for her affairs." Ethan's face reddened. "That was conversational. You also told me Florence wasn't fully comfortable dealing with complicated property matters anymore." I stared at my son. He wouldn't look at me. There it was. The larger story Rebecca had warned me about. Not just broke, not just grieving, incapable. Henry closed the folder. "I asked you for authorization before discussing any sale. You said paperwork could be provided." Ethan looked at me. "Mom, I was trying to keep options open." "For whom? For the family?" I shook my head. "No, for your company." Rebecca opened her portfolio. "Whatever your intention was, the situation is now simple. Formal notices have been issued. Florence is the only person authorized to direct decisions involving her interests unless she specifically delegates that authority." Ethan stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the doors you were trying to open are closed." The room went quiet. Bradley broke the silence. "And so is mine." Ethan turned toward him. "What I won't be investing in Crawford Urban Partners." "Bradley, don't make a decision based on family drama. I'm making it based on judgment." Ethan's face collapsed. "You came here planning to invest. I came here planning to listen. You don't understand what's at stake. I understand enough." Ethan stood again this time so quickly his chair scraped the floor. He looked at me with something between rage and desperation. "You did this." I felt the words like a slap. "I did what you turned everyone against me. I didn't tell Henry what to record. I didn't create that letter. I didn't hide your company's financial problems." His eyes widened. "You investigated me. I protected myself. I'm your son." His voice echoed through the room. I stood slowly. "And I'm your mother." My voice didn't shake. "You were supposed to love me, Ethan. Not turn my age, my grief, and my silence into tools you could use. I was trying to save everything I've built finally. The truth. Not my future. Not my security. His company." I looked at him for a long moment. "I would have listened if you'd asked for help." His expression changed, "But you didn't ask." I glanced at the false authorization letter. "You decided my life was something you could leverage." Ethan's shoulders dropped. Then he looked around the table at Rebecca, Henry, and Bradley. "Unbelievable. You trust all these people more than your own son." I felt tears sting my eyes, but I refused to look away. "No, Ethan." I spoke softly. "I trusted my son more than any of them." I pointed to the paper between us. "You're the one who taught me not to." For the first time that evening, Ethan had no argument. And as he stood in the same restaurant where he'd told everyone I had nothing left, he finally understood the truth. The person who had lost the most at that table wasn't me. I was never broke. Ethan left the private room without saying goodbye. Natalie followed him a few seconds later. The door closed behind them, and for the first time all evening, the room was completely still. I remained standing beside the table. Rebecca touched my arm. "Florence, I'm fine." It was the automatic answer. The answer women like me learn to give when being fine is the only thing holding us upright. But I wasn't fine. My son had tried to position himself between me and the life Richard and I had spent 40 years building. And somehow, beneath the anger, I still wanted to follow him into the parking lot. That was the terrible thing about loving your child. Love didn't disappear when trust did. Bradley quietly excused himself. Before leaving, he stopped beside me. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Thank you. And my decision about Ethan's company is mine. I know. I don't want you thinking you caused it." I appreciated that more than he probably realized. Henry remained by the door. Rebecca began gathering the documents. Then Henry said, "Florence, there's something I've been wondering. What did Ethan genuinely believe you were broke?" I gave a tired smile. I think he did. Henry shook his head. "How the answer was surprisingly simple because I let him." Rebecca looked up. No, Florence, I don't mean intentionally. I just never corrected his assumptions. I sat down again. Richard and I had never raised Ethan around conversations about net worth. He knew we were comfortable. He knew his father worked in commercial real estate and his mother worked in restaurant operations. But he didn't know the details. He didn't know about every property, every investment, every account, every decision we'd made instead of buying something flashy. After Richard died, I simplified even further, and Ethan mistook simplicity for scarcity. The house he thought I could no longer afford. There hadn't been a mortgage on it in 11 years. The Toyota he thought proved I was struggling. I'd paid cash for it. The restaurant distributions, they were only one stream among several. Richard had left retirement accounts. We owned investments accumulated over decades. I had my own portfolio. And Crawford Whitmore properties had appreciated far beyond anything George, Richard, or I could have imagined 27 years earlier. I wasn't fabulously wealthy by billionaire standards. But I was secure enough that barring catastrophe, I would never need Ethan to pay my electric bill. More importantly, I had choices. That was what money had always meant to Richard and me, freedom to choose, not an audience to impress. Richard used to say money should buy freedom, not an audience. I hadn't understood how deeply I'd absorbed that until Ethan showed me what happened when someone believed the opposite. The next morning, Rebecca came to my house. We sat at Richard's old desk. "I assume you want to update your estate plan." I stared at the framed photograph beside me. Yes. Until that moment, Ethan had been positioned to inherit most of what remained after my death. He was my only child. For years, the decision had seemed obvious. Richard and I had worked hard partly because we wanted Ethan to have security. But security without character could become entitlement. I don't want to disinherit him. Rebecca nodded. "I didn't expect you would. But I won't give him unrestricted control either. We discussed a trust, structured distributions, independent oversight. Protections that would prevent my estate from becoming an emergency rescue fund for whatever business decision Ethan made next." Then Rebecca asked, "What about the remainder I already knew?" Years earlier, Richard and I had talked about creating something for people working in hospitality. Young cooks, servers trying to attend community college, assistant managers pursuing certification. People like George Whitmore had once been talented, hardworking, and one bad season away from losing everything. "I want to establish a fund." Rebecca smiled. "What kind? Training and education? Restaurant and hospitality workers? Maybe small grants for certification programs? That can be done." I looked at Richard's photograph. He'd like that. "Yes," Rebecca said. "He would." The changes took time. I didn't rush them. This wasn't revenge. I wasn't moving money around because I wanted Ethan to suffer. I was deciding what responsibility looked like now that I knew my son could confuse inheritance with ownership. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Ethan finally came to my house. He looked exhausted, no suit, no polished confidence. He stood on my porch with his hands in his pockets. "Can I come in?" I let him. We sat in the living room. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he asked, "Did you change the will?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because even now, that was his first question. "Yes." His jaw tightened. "So that's it. What does that mean, you punish me by giving everything away?" "I didn't say I'm giving everything away. You're cutting me out." "No." I looked directly at him. "But what you eventually receive will be protected through a trust. Protected from who I waited." He understood. From me. From decisions made under pressure. He stood. "You really think I'm some kind of criminal? I think you're my son, and I think you crossed a line. I was desperate. I know. My company could collapse. I know that too. And you're sitting on all this money." There it was. I stood as well. Ethan listened carefully. He looked at me. I was never broke. His face tightened. "But that is not the lesson you should be learning." I stepped closer. "The lesson is that you believed I was broke." He said nothing. "And look at how you treated me when you believed it." His eyes dropped. "You made me smaller in front of strangers. You talked about moving me out of my home. You described me as confused. Then the moment you discovered I had assets, suddenly my opinions mattered enough for you to want control of them." "Mom?" "No." My voice remained calm. "You keep thinking this story is about how much money I have." I shook my head. "It isn't. It is about who you became when you thought I had nothing you wanted." He stared at the floor. I opened the front door. Ethan looked at me. For a moment I saw anger, then fear, then something that looked almost like shame. He walked outside without another word. I watched him drive away. I didn't feel victorious. I felt heartbroken. But for the first time in months, I also felt free. My money was protected. My future was mine. And whatever relationship Ethan and I had from that point forward would no longer be built on what he expected to inherit. It would have to be built on something much harder to earn back: trust. What my son really lost. For the next 2 months, Ethan barely spoke to me. I heard about his company through Rebecca, occasionally through people Richard and I had known in Charlotte's business community, and once unexpectedly through Bradley. Without Bradley's investment and without access to my assets, Crawford Urban Partners had to face its problems exactly as they were. No rescue, no family money disguised as corporate strength, no wealthy investor willing to ignore the numbers. Ethan sold one of his development projects at a painful discount. He downsized his office. Several plans he'd proudly described at Whitmore and Stone were postponed indefinitely. He didn't lose everything. That mattered to me. Despite everything he'd done, I never wanted to see my son homeless or destroyed. But he did lose something he'd spent years protecting: the appearance that nothing could touch him. The private club membership disappeared. The expensive SUV was replaced. The large office with the skyline view was exchanged for a smaller space. For Ethan, I suspected those losses hurt almost as much as the financial ones. Natalie took it badly. I knew only what Ethan eventually told me, and I refused to turn their marriage into another story I could judge from the outside. But money had apparently exposed cracks there too. Natalie had expected a particular life. Ethan had promised he could provide it. When that life began shrinking, their arguments grew. One afternoon, Ethan finally called. "Mom, I need to ask you something." I knew before he said it. How much silence? Then he named a figure. It was less than the value of the South End interest, but still substantial. What would it do? Give me breathing room for how long I don't know. Then it's not a solution. His voice sharpened. You could help me without even changing your lifestyle. That isn't the point. What is the point, Mom? Teaching me a lesson while my company burns? I closed my eyes. No, the point is that giving you money without fixing the problem would help you avoid the lesson. You're enjoying this. That hurt. You really believe that he didn't answer. I have cried over you more in the last 2 months than I did during some weeks after your father died. His breathing changed. I continued. I don't want you destroyed, Ethan, but I won't write a check. Then what will you do? I'll introduce you to someone who a restructuring advisor Richard trusted. He laughed bitterly. I don't need another consultant. You need someone who isn't impressed by you. Silence. I told him the advisor could review his debt projects, obligations, and options. There was one condition. You tell him everything. What does that mean? No polished version? No pretending a failing project is an expansion opportunity. No hidden obligations. No family assets that aren't yours. Ethan didn't respond. That's my offer. I asked my mother for help, and I'm offering it. Not the help I need. No. I spoke gently. It's the help you don't want. He hung up. For a while, I thought that would be the last conversation we'd have for months. Life became quiet again. I worked with Rebecca on the Hospitality Education Fund. Henry introduced me to 2 community college administrators. For the first time since Richard died, I found myself excited about building something new. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, nearly 4 months after the restaurant confrontation, my doorbell rang. I opened the door. Ethan stood alone. No Natalie, no leather portfolio, no documents. He looked thinner. Can I come in? I stepped aside. He walked into the living room but didn't sit until I did. For almost a minute, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan said, I met with your advisor. I looked at him. When 3 weeks ago? I hadn't known. He's brutal. Despite myself, I smiled. Your father liked him. That explains a lot. The smile disappeared from Ethan's face. We're restructuring the company. How bad? He rubbed his palms together. But survivable. I nodded. That's good. I sold another interest. Cut overhead? I'm negotiating the loan? He looked embarrassed. I also sold the SUV. I heard. Of course you did. No judgment. He nodded. Then silence returned. I could tell there was something else. Finally, Ethan looked at me. I've been thinking about that dinner. My chest tightened. I keep hearing myself say you were broke. I waited. I thought I was making myself look good. There was no excuse in his voice this time. I wanted Bradley to see me as responsible, successful, the son who took care of everyone. He swallowed. So I needed you to look like someone who needed taking care of. That was the first time he'd admitted it so clearly. But it got worse than that. His eyes filled. When the company started failing, I kept telling myself I was protecting the family, that if I could just get control of enough assets temporarily, I'd fix everything before anyone knew. I felt tears in my own eyes, and my signature. He looked down. I authorized someone in my office to prepare the letter using a signature sample. The truth hurt even though I had expected it. I told myself it wasn't a real transaction. It was still my name. I know. He wiped his face. Then he said the words I would remember for the rest of my life. Mom, I made you small so I could feel big. I covered my mouth. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't asking about the will. He wasn't asking me to forget. For the first time, Ethan was simply telling the truth. I'm sorry, he whispered. I reached across the space between us and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine. I love you, I said. He started crying. But loving you doesn't erase what happened. I know. And forgiveness isn't the same as trust. I know. Trust will take time. He nodded. How much? As much as it takes. We sat there holding hands while rain tapped against the windows. Nothing was magically repaired. The trust remained broken. The estate plan remained changed. Ethan would never control my finances. But something important had happened. My son had finally come through my door without asking what I could give him. And for the first time in a very long while, I could see the possibility that what Ethan had lost might eventually teach him how to become someone worth trusting again. The man who recognized me. Almost 1 year after the night Ethan told a table full of people that I was broke, I returned to Whitmore and Stone. This time there was no investor waiting, no performance, no discussion about my supposed financial problems, just dinner. I arrived early. Henry was standing near the entrance when I walked in. Mrs. Crawford. After a year, Henry, I think you can call me Florence. He smiled. I've been trying. He led me toward a quiet table near the windows. Ethan was coming later, so Henry sat with me for a few minutes. The restaurant looked almost exactly as it had that first night, yet it felt completely different. Maybe places don't change. Maybe we do. Henry poured water into my glass. There's something I've never fully explained. Why I was staring at you that night. I smiled. I assumed you recognized me. I did. But not the way you probably think. He stood. Wait here. A few minutes later, he returned carrying a framed photograph. It was old enough that the colors had faded. He placed it in front of me. My breath caught. There was George Whitmore standing outside his original restaurant. Beside him was Richard. And beside Richard was me. I must have been 42. My hair was darker. Richard was wearing the brown jacket I always hated. George stood between us, holding an oversized pair of ceremonial scissors. I touched the glass. I haven't seen this in years. My father kept a copy in his office. Henry sat down. When I was a kid, I'd go to the restaurant after school. That photograph was always there. I looked at him. He told me the story so many times I could probably repeat it word for word. Henry pointed toward Richard and me. He'd say, "Those two believed in me when nobody else did." My eyes filled. Henry continued. He said you didn't save him by giving him money. You saved him by treating him like a man who could still succeed. That sounded like something George would say. So when I saw you sitting here that night, I couldn't believe it. And that's why you stared. Yes, he laughed softly. I was trying to decide whether you were really Florence Crawford or whether my memory was playing tricks on me. I looked at the photograph again. All that time, Ethan had thought Henry's attention meant something else. Maybe pity, maybe suspicion. But Henry had been looking at me with gratitude. Not because of what I own now, because of something Richard and I had done nearly 3 decades earlier. That realization affected me more than any financial statement ever could. "Keep this," Henry said. "I can't. You can. Dad would have wanted you to have it." I pressed the frames against my chest. "Thank you." A few minutes later, Ethan arrived. He looked different. Not dramatically. He still wore a good jacket, still walked with confidence. But the restless need to impress everyone seemed quieter. His company had survived. Barely at first. He had sold another development interest, renegotiated debt, reduced overhead, and abandoned projects that should never have been started. Crawford Urban Partners was smaller now. But for the first time in years, Ethan told the truth when people asked how business was going. Recovering, he'd say. Not booming, not expanding aggressively. Recovering. Natalie and Ethan were still working through their marriage. I stayed out of it. Some lessons belonged to them. When Ethan reached the table, he kissed my cheek. "Hi, Mom. Hello, sweetheart." Then he saw Henry. "Mr. Whitmore. Ethan." My son hesitated. "There is something I owe you." Henry waited. An apology. Ethan sat down. "I lied about my authority concerning my mother's property, and I put you in a position you shouldn't have been in." Henry studied him. "Thank you for saying that. I also said things about Mom that weren't true." "Yes." Ethan looked embarrassed. Henry didn't rescue him from that discomfort. I appreciated that. Some apologies needed room to hurt. Dinner was simple. No business pitch. No audience Ethan needed to impress. We talked about ordinary things. My garden, Henry's children, a small renovation Ethan's company had completed. At one point, Ethan asked about the education fund Rebecca and I had created. We had already approved our first group of grants for hospitality workers pursuing training and certifications. Dad would have liked that, Ethan said. I think so. He nodded. Then he looked at Henry. Mom told me what your father used to say about them. Henry smiled. My dad never forgot. Ethan became quiet. I did. I looked at him. He continued. I forgot who my parents actually were because I got too busy measuring what everyone had. That sentence would have been impossible for Ethan a year earlier. I reached across the table and touched his hand. We're all allowed to learn late. Dessert came. 3 coffees followed. Then the check arrived. The server placed it discreetly beside Ethan. Henry immediately reached for it. No. Ethan picked it up. Henry laughed. You're in my restaurant, and she's my mother. For 1 second, all 3 of us became still. The same words could carry completely different meanings depending on the heart behind them. A year earlier, Ethan had paid because he wanted everyone to believe his mother couldn't. Tonight, he wasn't performing for anyone. Bradley wasn't there. Natalie wasn't there. No potential investor was watching. Ethan simply took out his card. My treat, Mom. I smiled. Thank you. He looked almost surprised that I didn't argue. Outside, the Charlotte evening was warm. Henry walked us to the door. Before leaving, I turned back toward the dining room. I could see the table where everything had started. For months, I'd remembered that place as the table where my son humiliated me. Now I understood it differently. It was the table where a lie became visible, where Henry's stare forced open a door Ethan hadn't expected, where I discovered that being underestimated could sometimes reveal more about the person judging you than about yourself. Ethan and I walked toward the parking lot. My Toyota was still there. I had never replaced it. Ethan looked at the car and smiled. You're really going to drive that thing forever, aren't you, as long as it starts? He laughed. Then his expression softened. Mom, yes, I know saying sorry doesn't fix everything. No, I know I may never get back the trust I had. I looked at him. You don't need the trust you had. He frowned. What does that mean, that trust was careless? We both took it for granted. I touched his arm. We're building something new. He nodded slowly. Better, more honest. I opened my car door. Behind us, the lights of Whitmore and Stone glowed through the windows. Henry had recognized me because his father remembered an act of faith from decades earlier. Ethan had underestimated me because he'd forgotten that worth wasn't visible in cars, clothes, or bank statements. And I had learned something too. Forgiveness didn't mean returning to who we were before the betrayal. Sometimes healing meant becoming people who could never go back. As I drove home, Henry's old photograph rested carefully on the passenger seat. Richard smiled at me from behind faded glass. And for the first time since this story began, I wasn't thinking about what my son had tried to take from me. I was thinking about what we might still have time to rebuild. For most of my life, I thought the greatest inheritance Richard and I could leave our son was financial security. I was wrong. Money can buy a house, it can rescue a business, it can make difficult years easier, but it cannot give someone character. And sometimes the clearest way to discover how someone truly values you is to see how they treat you when they believe you have nothing left to offer. When Ethan thought I was broke, he made me smaller so he could look bigger. When he discovered I had money, his concerns suddenly became urgent. That hurt more than I can describe. But I also learned that love and boundaries can exist together. I could love my son without giving him access to my accounts. I could forgive him without pretending he had never betrayed my trust. I could offer him a second chance without rescuing him from the consequences of his first choices. Forgiveness is not the same as access, and healing is not forgetting. Real healing began when Ethan stopped asking what I could give him and started taking responsibility for what he had done. If you're a parent, especially an older parent, please remember this living simply doesn't make you unsuccessful. Growing older doesn't make you incapable. Loving your children doesn't require surrendering your dignity, independence, or right to make your own decisions. Richard used to tell me that money should buy freedom, not an audience. Now I understand something more. The richest legacy we leave behind may have nothing to do with money at all. George Whitmore remembered us because we believed in him when he was struggling. Henry remembered because his father taught him gratitude. And Ethan finally began changing when he understood that inheritance isn't something your parents owe you. Trust is earned, respect is demonstrated, and love when it's healthy doesn't need control. So let me ask you something. If you were in my place, would you have given Ethan another chance after everything he did, or would the forged signature have ended the relationship forever? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone who was underestimated, betrayed, or forced to protect their dignity from the people closest to them, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about family consequences, second chances, and the strength it takes to stand up for yourself.